All right, so we're first going to put a layer of paint on some of our boxes so that it can dry, because some of these techniques are better for paint on top of a layer of paint. So I'm just going to pick up some water and add it to my yellow to create a soft spot. And the next thing that you'll do is take your yellow paint, and yellow is great because it's your lightest color, and put it on top of those boxes that are marked that need to have a dry layer of paint. So your pan, which is wet paint on a dry surface with two colors, one of those colors needs to be dry. And you can see I'm filling in this space by pulling down on my paintbrush. I'm not pushing up on my paintbrush. That's just gonna like flour it out. Another one that is best to have a layer of paint on is salt. And again, I am working with nice long strokes of paint. Dry brush is best with a layer of paint. So I'm using really saturated paint here. As you can see, it's super bright. So I don't have a lot of water in my well here. Glaze is also a really good one to have a layer of paint down, because glaze is all about adding thin layers of paint on top of another layer of paint. But we'll get to those in a little bit. Let's start working on our first couple boxes. So this one here is the tube paint, which is wet paint on top of a dry surface. So this is dry here. To get the tube paint onto your surface, I'm going to use some palette paper. It's like a waxy paper. You do have this in your kit. If you don't have this with you, you can use anything that's like plasticky. Even the lid of your kit or a plastic bag will work. So I'm just going to take a tiny, tiny amount of paint and squish it out onto my surface. You can see it was really liquidy. Sometimes something like golden comes out. That's your binder. And if that happens, you can just massage your tube a little bit. You want like a pinprick of paint. So even that is more than I need. Since it's watercolor, you will be adding watercolor to it, or you will be adding water to it to thin it out and make it less pigmented and more translucent. And you'll spread that onto your surface. So the great thing about tube watercolor is they are highly pigmented, and the thicker and more concentrated your color is, the more you're going to see a darker or brighter color in your space. But you could also add a lot of water to it and spread that out and have a lighter valued color. So I'm just going to set that aside. That's the only time that we're going to need to use the tube. I wanted you to experience it because tubes are really great ways to work with your watercolor. Super highly pigmented in most cases. And nice to work with. But most of the time we're going to be working with our pans because it has, the range of colors. So let's see, that's still wet. So we're going to move on to that later. Let's do the graded wash. And to do the graded wash, I'm going to work with a darker color because it's easier to see. So I added water to my pan, but I'm going to dry my paintbrush off because there's a lot of pigment and there's a lot of water in my paintbrush. And here I want a mostly dry paintbrush. I'm going to pick up some of that really nice concentrated color, add it to the left-hand side. And now I'm going to dip my paintbrush, just the corner of my paintbrush, into the water to add a little more water to my paintbrush and pull it right next to it. And I'm brushing back and forth and up and down to get a gradation. We've talked about this before. It's a blend from light to dark. You don't want too much water on your brush, so if you have to, just dot your brush off on your paper towel. so that you can get a nice smooth transition from bright to light. Add more water and brush more so that it's light to dark just by adding more water to your brush. But don't add too much or else it's not going to change enough, or the change won't be so gradual. All right, so now we have wet on wet with one color. That's wet paint onto a wet surface. So we are going to paint in water, and my water is a little blue, but it does help you see where it's going. We're going to paint water into the box, and now we are going to paint our concentrated color into that water. This is very helpful for if you have like a very specific shape that you need to follow, because the paint does help fill in right up to the edge of where all the water is. So it kind of bleeds out to these other areas. So this would start to bleed out into the corner. When you have your paper taped down, it also creates a really nice even surface because that paper doesn't ripple as much. Our next one is wet on wet. So we're working with wet paint on a wet surface, but with two colors. So if this was with one color, this is with two colors, we're going to paint a color in first, and then we're going to put a second color on top. So I'm going to work first with my yellow. That way you're really able to see a distinct change here. We've got wet paint. I clean my brush off, pick up some more wet paint, and paint with wet paint on top of wet paint. And what happens is that wet paint bleeds out. So you can see it did not stay in crisp, clean lines. It is really starting to feather out and soften around the edges. And as it dries, more of that will happen, especially that center line. All right, so we have now a dry surface here to paint on. So when we paint with wet paint on top of wet paint, it fans out. When we paint with wet paint on top of dry paint, you're going to see the difference here. Did it fan out? There is a distinct difference in what happened in the wet on dry versus the wet on wet. So this is really great if you have details that are blurry and in the background, and this is really great if you have details that are crisp and have a sharp edge to them. Because I can even paint over this yellow and have a really sharp edge and completely lose that area. All right, so you have seen how to do our first few and get some extra layers on the boxes that need to be dry. So I want you to pause this video, and then you are going to do these sections. Then play the next video.